So just as you stated, I came to Newton in 1978 to paint a mural, and I had no idea about the sport of baseball being played in Kansas. Actually, I was surprised when I met my wife, who actually asked me to come to Kansas to paint. At the time, she was just a fellow art student. And she told me she lived in Kansas, and I was really surprised because I was, being from California, I was under the assumption that only Mexicans lived in California, Arizona, Texas, and I was really surprised that she was from Kansas. And then even more surprising was that she told me that she wanted to paint a mural, and would I be interested? And I said, yeah, I think that's a great idea. What's the mural about? She goes, well, it's to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Mexican-American fast pitch tournament in Newton. And like, once again, that was like the very first time I heard about baseball and fast pitch. And, but I was game. I said, yeah, sure, that sounds like a great idea. So she came back. This was right as the school year ended. She flew back to Kansas, got the go ahead, because actually this was just her idea. She said, I'm going to do it. She hadn't even talked to the committee or anything. She came back, got to the committee, got them to agree to pay for the supplies, but we would paint it for free. And so once she got to go ahead, she sent me the check in California. And then I had to actually go back to San Francisco, buy the paints, load them up, and then drive to Kansas. And that took me about 3 days because I had a breakdown. But eventually I made it here to Kansas. And then we had to put the mural together. So I'm talking about, this is maybe the end of May. I get here and we've got 1 month to paint this mural. And then we have to collect all the imagery to actually commemorate the tournament in itself. So we found the ball team picture. So there's the gentleman there. And then it was all the other facets of the community that had, Newton's Mexican community that had come to Newton. So we highlighted that too. But this was just kind of the mural that we got painted. We hung it the day before. We worked like crazy figuring out how to use the mural paints. And then, but once again, because it commemorated the ball tournament, we wanted to just focus on the ball players initially for this presentation. So even though there's other aspects in the mural, the ball tournament is, and baseball in Kansas is what I'm really focusing on. So that's kind of why I've highlighted him. So really you're looking at a league of our own. Mexican-American baseball in Kansas was something that had started as early as when the immigrants first came here. This is just a great picture that was shared with me. This is Newton's baseball players practicing out in the field at Athletic Park, Newton, Kansas. And then I need a drink. And then how did Mexicans even get here? Like I said, I was surprised that there was Mexicans in Kansas. Well, over the years, I've done some research, and this is kind of a good example. This is an article that I found in the Newton Republic, the newspaper. And it says, a carload of Mexicans was sidetracked at the station a couple of hours ago, or this morning. The greasers, now, they're not necessarily politically correct at the time. So the greasers were from El Paso and were on their way to Florence, where they will labor on the double tracking job. The greasers seem to have a fondness for watermelons, and Joanna Werner sold out her supply of melons to them in short order. The greasers were working at Park City a few weeks ago. So this is kind of like their introduction to Kansas to Mexicans via the local newspaper. And then one of the gentlemen that came is Mr. Canuto Hasso. This is him as a railroad worker. They got a photograph of him. He comes to work from the Santa Fe in 1990, and he brings his sons, Magdaleno and Raimundo. And he had come to Kansas, even though he was living in Texas, he had come because of a funeral of a family member that was up here. And once he was here, the other immigrant Mexican workers that were here actually persuaded him to come and stay and work at Newton. And so that's what he did. He came, he brought his family, he brought his boys with him and his family. And just wanted to point out that eventually, these are the places that they could have worked in Kansas, because these are all on the railroad lines. And these are kind of the different cities on those railroad lines that you would have found Mexican communities and eventually baseball teams. So he brought his boys with him, and once again, coming from Texas, Texas was really, they were in Texas already playing ball, because actually baseball had been introduced to Mexico. It was in the immediate 1880s. Baseball was invented in the United States around 1860. So these, his sons were already playing ball in Texas when they came to Newton, and they just kind of carried on that tradition of playing ball here. So this is an early photograph of them, and they don't have any kind of uniforms. They're, they're just playing the regular sandlot kind of baseball. They're playing with fellow friends, challenging each other to games in their little camps that they had. But it gets a little more serious after that. This is a good example. This is Newton team, the Cuauhtemoc team back in 1930s, probably around 1932. This is them taking a form of portrait at the Ranchito. And once again, the Ranchito is the laborers' camps that the Santa Fe provided for them. So they lived in these housing units. This is actually the second housing unit. This is the brick unit. They had an earlier housing unit that was made of railroad ties, but the Santa Fe realized that those homes were kind of pretty shabby looking. So they built a little better looking ones that were on the main railroad line, so that when passengers went by, they saw homes that were a little more dignified as opposed to the rough housing that they had shown earlier. So this is where the railroad workers actually got together and provided their teams. And then I colorized this photo just to kind of give you an idea. I kind of enjoy doing that. So it kind of gives them a little more of a natural look as opposed to always being black and white. Their uniforms were a gray kind of color. And then the brick units were, the red brick. And to me, it just kind of gives them a little more life to the photograph that we collect. And then this is actually one of the original uniforms. This is the only one that I know of. This belonged to Ramon Padrosas. That was his Cuauhtemoc uniform. Now, Cuauhtemoc is a kind of a standard ancient Aztec name. It's actually the name of the last Aztec emperor that was defeated by Cortez when he conquered Mexico City. So that's kind of a revered name in the Mexican culture. And so it was kind of interesting to see that they used that in the uniform of that time. Now they went, this is a great story here. Frank Lujano, one of the members of the team, and the gentleman's uniform, that owns the uniform, Raymond Pedrosa, remember the second year they played ball in the 1930s. The team members bought their uniforms from Anderson's Sporting Goods, and which is now Anderson's bookstore, and it's still there. And each player paid $27 for their uniforms, which included shoes. At the time, $27 was a lot of money, and the store owner, Mr. Anderson, allowed them to pay on credit. The Cuauhtemocs played all Mexican-American teams and were the champs of 1932. Now, who did they play? That is the only part of when we do this research of where they played and who they played, because it isn't something I could find like in researching in the newspapers and things like that. So, but here's one cool story. The Cuauhtemocs remember a game when a team from Alamo, Kansas, challenged them to play ball because word had gotten around that Newton had one hell of a team. Don Santo Romero had a Model T, and everyone would pitch in money for gasoline, and off they would go. When the team arrived to play at the festivities in Alamo, the boys were amazed because no one mentioned in the conversation what kind of ball would be played. Alamo, Kansas played hardball, and the Cuauhtemoc team had only softball equipment. Not to be discouraged, the Cuauhtemocs continued with the game. The Newton boys took turns pitching for their team, but it gives no outcome or how it ended or how they if they ever played again. It's just one of those cool stories about there's at least some recorded history of what they did do when they were in uniform with the Cuauhtemocs. Oops, the wrong one. This I also found interesting too, because once again, that was a Mexican team. And so Mexicans play with Mexican teams, whites play with whites, and African Americans play with African Americans. Except in this exception that I found very interesting. Once again, just going through research, I found this game, and this is in 1936. And I look and I notice there's Rodriguez and there's Vega and Rodriguez playing on these two teams. Well, the two teams that they're playing on are African American teams. So there was no discrimination if they needed a first baseman or a pitcher. The African American team actually approached the Mexicans and asked them to play on their teams. It wouldn't happen the other way. They wouldn't be asked to play on white teams, but it was still kind of an interesting sight to see that they were able to play with that. And I know that because I see some of those names on the roster. Those are Newton, their members are from the African American community. So that was really quite a surprise when I found that a little jewel. And then once again, I spent quite a bit of time in the library. So this caught my eye. 1936, Mexican team wins games with scores of 13-3, 15-2, and 14-2. Yet not one Mexican player was selected to the All-Stars of the SS League. Now, I'm not sure what the SS League, if it's like a little league, but I just noticed, I even found each one of the games, and then on the final selection of the All-Stars, you go through the first team and the second team, and there are no Mexicans listed, even though I'm thinking with those kind of scores, I would think that maybe somebody would qualify. And the other thing is there's also colored teams playing in that league. So I would not be surprised if they were also not selected to the teams. Okay, so who would the Cuauhtemocs play? Well, one of them could have been Los Nacionales, which was a Wichita team. They probably went through the same process as the Cuauhtemocs as far as acquiring their uniforms. They actually have some really nice, beautiful pinstripe uniforms. And they're, once again, taking that American name and making it in Spanish. So they're the Nationals, but they become Los Nacionales. So they're an example of the kind of teams that Newton could have played at that time, especially when they had that claim that they were the champions in 1932. Who were they champions against? Maybe the Nacionales, maybe Las Cometas. The Comets were a Topeka team playing at that same era, playing ball. And once again, Las Cometas are a Mexican team with a Spanish name taken from like an American name. So even though they're the Comets, they actually go by themselves as Las Cometas. And once again, they're having to deal with that segregation and discrimination, but yet they're still able to become their own team members. Some organizations that actually catered to them and that gave them those opportunities, one of them was the Optimist Club. Optimist Club of Topeka sponsored Mexican American baseball in the early 30s. The mission of the Optimist International is to bring out the best in youth through community volunteers. They also operated in Newton. I've read research of the Optimist Club of Newton sponsoring clubs. So it was just one way to kind of get them involved in sports. So even as simple as their uniforms are, it was still an opportunity for the young youth of the Mexican community to participate in sports. Topeka, Kansas, 1929 baseball team. With like a lot of other teams, this team was called the Swat Democracy too. So it's like one of those popular names from Mexican culture. So they also took that name, and maybe that's where the Newton team got their idea from, or the idea of Los Cuauhtemocs. But this is kind of an example of an early team using that Spanish surname to name their team. This one I found interesting, 1932, those Bakers. It's kind of like Spanglish, the Bakers. They're a team from Topeka. This has an interesting story here that the women sewed the bases from worn out pillows, sometimes dried out cow chips were used as bases too. Because Mexicans were often segregated into the less desirable areas of town, like near rivers, several Mexican communities were destroyed by massive floods. Unfortunately, important family documents, precious photographs, and hand-me-down family heirlooms were often lost forever. And this actually happened in Newton as well. Newton built Our Lady of Guadalupe's initial site to build their church was actually in a flood zone. And it was after a flood that destroyed and flooded out a number of homes, including a lot of Mexican homes, that Our Lady of Guadalupe actually decided not to build there and instead built in a different place. But that was an example of how flooding, because of where they lived, impacted their community. All right, another team from Topeka is Los Piratas, or the Pirates, but once again, they're just taking that American name and giving it that little Spanish flavor. And so once again, is it a team that Los Cuauhtemocs of Newton played, or Los Cuauhtemocs from Topeka surely would have been a descendant or maybe even a carryover to that team. But it's still, and then this photo kind of grabs my interest because it almost looks like it's a 1950s kind of photograph. But the thing that as I look at it and study it, I look at those baseball gloves, and those are very old baseball gloves. And even the gentlemen at the very top, they have those little caps that everybody kind of wore back in the day. So to me, it kind of, even though it seems like a newer photo, some of those little clues kind of give it away as to being even older than it seems. And then you kind of, we're in the 30s now, kind of moving into the 40s. The Cuauhtemocs actually were Newton's first organized team, but then there was a younger team that came up that challenged them. And these guys were the Los Rayos, or the Lightning Bolts. And this is just kind of a photo montage that I put together of the team and the church where they played. They never really took their picture in front of it, but we used this for one of their little booklets for the souvenirs that we sold at one of the tournaments. And the other thing is, I don't know what color their uniforms were. Notice I wear blue. I figured, well, that's probably a nice color to put in there. So I used blue as their team colors. It could have been red, it could have been green, who knows? But I would figure the jeans were blue. So if anything, but it was just one chance to once again, just give it a little more life. All right, so Newton's tournament started in 1946, but in research, I realized that once again, I found this old ad, and in 1940, August 1940, Newton sponsored an all-Mexican softball tournament. Newton actually, the Mexican Catholics had already been playing in other tournaments. I've seen them where they were playing in, and they were in white tournaments, and they were playing in Lions. I've seen where they played in Huts, but they also sponsored Mexican tournaments. And so this is really the first one that I recorded. They played in 1940 in an all-Mexican tournament sponsored by the Newton Mexican Catholics. Now, this is the newspaper writing. The newspaper never really said Los Cuauhtemocs or Los Rayos. They just always said Newton Mexican Catholics. That isn't necessarily the name that they went by, but that's what the newspapers recorded them as. And then what's cool about this is that the following teams have entered the tournament. Topeka Optimists, which we talked about, Joe's Place of Topeka, Florence, Canopolis, Salina, which is now Lions, Hutchinson, and Newton. And then on the very bottom, it says Joe's Place of Topeka won the all-Mexican tournament team. I don't know who Joe's Place of, I've never seen a photograph of it. Those are one of those little tidbits of history, or those you would just like to see who was that team. Was it a put together team, or was it an actual team, and who sponsored them? Well, Joe's Place. What was Joe's Place, a bar, a business? What is it that sponsored it? So I found that very interesting. And then the following year, in 1941, the Newton Optimists won the Hutchinson All-Mexican Tournament. Once again, naming Estrada and Frank Flores as the winning pitchers. But unfortunately, this was kind of like the beginning of the tournaments, but then World War II came. And when World War II came, all these young men ended up going off to serve. And that kind of put a stop to the tournaments. So once again, the Mexican Catholics, as recorded in the newspaper, these are probably Los Rayos, but they kind of like the names fluctuate back and forth. And then once again, a baseball team, late 30s, early 40s, they were still playing. A great photo of them in Newton back when they were a young team. And then in 1988, this is a photograph of them at the bottom left of them, as they were older gentlemen, still attending the tournaments in Newton. And this is actually at Newton's ballpark where they're shown. And then they would have played other teams coming to play in Newton. So here's a 1946 Our Lady of Perpetual Help from Wichita that came to play in the tournament. They built their community was on the north side of Wichita, the north end as it's considered. And so they would have supplied a team to come to the tournament as well. The Argentine Eagles could have sent a team. Now the Argentine Eagles veterans sponsorship is interesting because their Legion post was actually developed because in 1947, when the men had come out of the service, they were looking for a place to maybe be part of a veterans group. So they approached the local American Legion post, and the gentleman that said there says, well, we don't accept Mexicans in our post. And that kind of was a slap in the face to these veterans that had already served in World War II, had defended and fought for their country. So they turned around and founded their own post. And in 1948, Joe Salazar was the first Argentine Eagles American Legion post commander. And so then they eventually sponsored a number of not just ball clubs, they would have sponsored basketball teams and any youth programs as well. So even out of that discrimination, they were able to kind of succeed. And then as far Western Kansas was even baseball was played. Once again, within those Mexican communities and those railroad towns, they were playing. So Jay Martinez was playing for a number of teams in Dodge City. Now, here's an exception to the rule that I'm always talking about, that they're playing with Mexican teams, but Jay and his brother, Ray, actually played for the liberal Kansas Black Sox because there were not that many Mexicans in town, and there were probably not enough men to field a full team. So they made that exception to say, you know what, I think we should allow some Mexicans to play. But that was a rarity, but I have seen it in other research, if they're a small town, that they would allow the Mexicans to play on the team. But that, once again, it was a rare exception. And then, because now it was World War II, well, all these young men in Newton, especially all the young Mexican men left that were working on the railroad. And the railroad was actually kind of in dire need of laborers. So they developed the United States developed the Bracero program, which was to bring Mexican laborers to the United States to work on, and in a number of fields, but in Newton's case, they came to work in the railroad. And so they were replacing the Mexican locals with braceros from Mexico. And this photograph is the Bracero baseball team. And they're playing the Newton local high school. Well, I guess you could call it like the Babe Ruth League team. It says Newton Post number 2. And one gentleman, Elmer Vega, World War II veteran, and raised in Newton, he was actually put in charge of the braceros. And excuse me, and he called me up one time. This was back when we were doing research during the Fiesta days, and we were searching for different photos. And Elmer called me up just to let me know that he had worked with those braceros. And the one thing I remember him saying was, eran muy cabrones, that they were real like hard heads to work with, but he did the best he could with them. So I always enjoyed that story. All right, and then other teams, once again, we're running the gamut of teams that run through here. So here's a 1946 Garden City team, played at Finney Park. Once again, veterans group, GI forums, Mexican veteran clubs, all these groups kind of organized to help support growing of the baseball spirit in teams and games that occurred there. All right, so I wanted to point this one out. This one really is one of my favorite finds. And I mean, I didn't find it, I was just introduced to it. This is a great story. The poster on the left is called The Roll of Honor of World War II Veterans from Our Lady of Guadalupe and Newton. And then, now realize that when I'm focusing on Newton, this story occurs everywhere in all these Mexican towns, all these Mexican communities all through these railroad towns, all throughout Kansas. So this poster hung in Newton's, but there could have been one in Topeka, there could have been one in Garden City, there could have been one in Kansas City. And this poster was actually shown to me by Rosalio Cuellar. And he was a local businessman in Newton. And to me, he's a historian. He was one of those guys that when I was out researching history, he was one of my go-to guys, like, Russ, tell me about this, or what about that? And he said, hey, Raymond, I want to show you something. So he brought this poster out, and it's a good sized poster. He goes, I want you to know, I found this poster in the trash at the church. And he said that a new father had come in and he was just cleaning house. And when he happened to be at the church, he found this in the trash, and he said, I could not let this as a treasure beyond measure, beyond worth. And so he was able to salvage that. And so when you look at it, these are all the men from Our Lady of Guadalupe serving in World War II. And that's quite a bit of them. So that's why you have the braceros, because you had all these young men from the church and the community of Newton itself serving in World War II. So this is why the railroad needed laborers to fill those voids. And then right to the right, I just like that title, mythical title won by Newton, veterans. Now that's for basketball, but you got to realize that those men that are playing basketball were also playing baseball. And then this is an invitation from Our Lady of Guadalupe Perpetual Help in Wichita that invited the Newton team and the Hutchinson team to play in their tournament. And Wichita had two teams playing. But it was just a great headline to show that they were still having to, even in 1947, Jackie Robinson is maybe going to be able to desegregate sports, but until then, it was still Mexican playing against Mexican teams. So I kind of just appreciate that they see. And in fact, in the line it says, an invitation of Our Lady of Perpetual Help basketball team, 4 parishes made up mostly of Latin American World War II veterans engaged in a one-day basketball tournament in the cathedral gym to determine the mythical Mexican basketball championship of the Wichita district. I just think that's a great opening line. And then this is I'm only going to deviate just a little here, just to show you basketball, because once again, these were Mexican teams that were playing. This is a late 30s Newton basketball team. These men would eventually go off to war during World War II, but here they were playing basketball, organized basketball against other Mexican teams or African-American teams. And they were wearing uniforms, hand-me-downs from the high school, because they were not allowed to play play on the regular basketball teams or the school's teams. They actually had to play in a secondary gym, not even in the main gym, which is a whole other story in Newton, but I won't go there. And then once again, 1950s, you're looking at clubs that are playing as well. Here's a Garden City one. So I'm just trying to show you the breadth of teams that were playing in Kansas. So here's another one, 1950s Garden City Latin American Club, included highly decorated veterans from World War II. Once again, they come back and they're encountering racism. And so they're still just saying, we're going to still just play our game within our communities. State Line Locos, another 50s team. And once again, they're still keeping that Mexican tradition of having a Spanish surname, a Spanish name to their club's name. So State Line Crazies that's kind of a cool name, but it bodes well there to be the locals. Wichita Aztecas, Newton and Wichita had kind of like, they were constantly playing each other. It wasn't that surprising. I mean, they played in the tournament, but I've also read of games that were just played just for just to play the game. Wichita would invite them down, Newton come down, and there would be a little ad in the paper saying that Wichita, Newton, Mexican Catholics are going to be playing a game in Wichita on a Tuesday night or something like that. It wasn't even any league. But once again, a great photo of capturing that era. Once again, there's those caps and the glove, that catcher's glove dates that to a pretty early time. And then Wellington, I just found this photo recently. And I remember seeing it a couple of years ago, and I was able to make contact with the lady, Mona Jimenez, and share it with me. And it's Watkins Drug Store. And now the cool thing about this is that the businesses that maybe discriminated against them or were kind of like had issues with the Mexicans serving on white teams, they didn't have a problem with saying, well, you know what? If you're going to keep to yourselves, we'll sponsor you. So here's an example of that, where this all Mexican team is wearing Watkins drug jerseys. That meaning that drugstore is sponsoring them, whether it's buying uniforms, helping with the travel expenses and whatnot. And then I also was able to date this because I found out that Watkins Drugs was sold in 1953 and changed the name. So that's kind of like that business doesn't exist anymore. But once again, it shows you throughout Kansas, the different teams that were playing. No different than the story that happens in Newton can happen in Wellington, Topeka, Kansas City, Garden City, all throughout the state of Kansas. And then the tournament, the tournament that I came to paint a mural for, I showed you one where it was 1940, but the war stopped all the tournaments, so they weren't able to continue. Well, this was the tournament starting again right after the war. The men came back. And so once again, they're ready to play ball again. So they started a softball tournament, and it's on July 4th. This ad says July 3rd. It's run in the newspaper that the Daylight Softball Tournament sponsored by the Mexican Catholics also is scheduled for Thursday at Athletic Park. So they're only doing it on one day, the 4th of July. And then they have teams from Topeka, Emporia, Wichita, and Hutchinson are expected to compete in the single elimination games. The games will start at 10 and they continue throughout the day. And they have a little fiesta and maybe even a dance. That eventually is how they develop. And then the second one is Mexican teams in softball tournament. That's in 1947. But the one thing about that one is that there's no record of who won that tournament. So there's nothing in there. It just says it's going to happen. And I even found an ad in an Emporia newspaper that said the 7-uppers from Emporia were not going to be playing that weekend because they were going to this tournament in Newton. But I don't know who won the tournament. But in 1948, now they're starting to have this this tournament going, yearly. So in 1948, the Newton McGee's team wins the tournament. Then it's recorded in the papers. And also Newton McGee's, once again, the Mexican team, they're playing in the city softball league. And they win the title in 1949 of the city league title, champions of the city league. But they're still just Mexican teams versus white or colored teams. And then this is just one thing that black and white doesn't do for a lot of uniforms and those times is it doesn't show you the real color of how colorful their uniforms were. So this is a great example of their uniforms. They were red and actually had a little highlight of yellow in it. But somebody had got this photo colorized, and I just wanted to kind of share that. It gives you an example of how colorful and beautiful those uniforms were. And I know of only one uniform that is in existence, but it's in California right now. Then, other teams that came to play, Hutchinson teams, came to play in the tournament. Once again, Newton, Hutchinson, Emporia, and Wichita, those are those kind of local teams that were the nucleus of those early tournaments. And then here's a booklet that tells when Newton, during its holy day, great days, was winning a number of tournaments. But the sad thing here is I've yet to find any photographs of those teams. And it would be nice to have had them in here to show you Newton teams, to show you other teams, Hutchinson, Wichita. But I am missing those. So that the search and the journey still continues to this day. Oh, but also realize that the women were also participants in these tournaments as well. Only maybe as a sideshow, but still, these women were also participating and even playing in the city league. And then there's one case here where I found a little ad where the Newton Mexican girls softball team, sponsored by CityCat, will play a North Wichita team at Wichita Sunday afternoon, 2:30. It's no tournament, it's no city league. They just challenge each other all the time. And so that's a great example of the women playing each other and contributing to the tournament success. And also, besides being the cooks and the sponsors of that, taking care of the men in the community, with, when they're serving the food and having it available, they're also playing ball too as well. And then just once again, McGee's wins 48, but then there's I had to highlight it. Mexican girls won from Alliance girls team in an exhibition contest. So once again, they're still contributing to that tournament. And a great shot of the Wichita team that would have been playing against the Newton City Cab. And there's the great Azteca team. I mean, when I say Azteca, I mean that name. That name is like probably the most utilized name of any baseball teams. I think this Azteca, not only for the women's team here, but I know there's the men's teams that are Aztecas. My wife's dance troupe happens to be the Azteca dancers as well. So it's just one of those names that's synonymous with true Mexican culture. All right, so showing you a number of the teams over the years, but to me, this tournament has generated a number of teams or generational players. So you have like in Newton, you have Paul Vega family. Almer Vega was the one gentleman that I talked about playing as early as with an African-American team. He played on the early Los Rayos teams. He played basketball. Then his son became a very famous pitcher, and his grandsons played as well in the tournament. So they carried on that tradition. You have, when I showed you Canuto Hasso, the very first gentleman that came and played, well, here are his descendants. They're called the J Train and Los Gavilanes. They carry on that tradition of family playing in the tournament as well. And then this is just one kind of example of how family developed in a team. This is Blanco Gomez from Topeka. He was voted in 1979 as the most valuable pitcher, but his three boys were also playing on the team, and they were also voted on the All-Star team. So that's like one of his great, proudest moments. And there's one of their souvenirs of the Holy Dame All-Star Tournament team from back in the day. And then I consider Newton, this is a bold statement. I know it's not really true, but I believe it. Newton, Kansas is the Cooperstown of Mexican-American baseball because it's home of the oldest Mexican-American fast pitch tournament in the country. And so how do I back that up? Well, they've since 1994, they've had this Hall of Fame for all the players that have played in the tournament. These are the, up until 2018, they've already got to 2021. They started out with Newton people, but then they spread it out to all those people within the communities that participated to make the tournament a success. And then just covering that, we've covered the historical aspect of the community. There's the one photo I told you about in the booklet. The All-Stars 1946 to 1970 is a booklet that Reynaldo Gonzalez, the gentleman in the photo there, he just passed. But okay, when we had the 70th, 2018, Reynaldo, right as the tournament was over, Reynaldo found me at the end of the tournament and said, Ray, I've been working on this book of these All-Stars for the last 5 years. Can you help me put together a booklet that we can have for the tournament. And so we worked on this booklet off of his, and this is all his doing of saying, I know who the best all-stars of Our Lady of Guadalupe from 1946 to 1970. From pitchers, first base, second base, all the positions on the team. And we put together this booklet and had that for sale at the last tournament in 2019. And he passed that following year. So it's a great honor to have at least worked with him and helped him present that history of what he considered the great all-stars of Newton. And then once again, over the years, the 50th, we did a great show at the Coffin Museum. There's great history in 1988 booklet by Paula Hassel that documented the history of the tournament in itself. And so once again, these are the historians that assisted me, that I kind of standing on their shoulders as far as how documented this history goes. And then of course, working with the book, this is just something, the one thing here I want to point out is that this book dealt with the teams of Kansas City, but all these players that were talking about this said, but you have to mention Newton's tournament. So that's how I kind of like am involved in this, because Newton has always been the focal point of my research, and yet it was one great chance to kind of highlight it in the book as well. And then the final part for Cooperstown is they had their own stadium, because the city was actually giving them a hard time letting them play. So Reynaldo Gonzalez, the gentleman that put together the All-Star book, said we need to have our own ballpark, and went so far as to build their own ballpark, Our Lady of Guadalupe ballpark, right behind the church. And so to me, the legacy continues with the tournament. You know, they honor the old timers to come and play on the opening night. They honor them with Hall of Fame inductees. Some of the great pictures, they always acknowledge who some of the greats were. And, you know, once again, just in closing, Mexican immigrants that came to Kansas at the turn of the century to work on the railroad were already playing baseball, the great American pastime. Introduced to Mexico around the 1800s, the new arrivals enjoyed the sport and its competitive spirit. And even in the face of prejudices and discrimination, they persevered in the love of the game. These photos that I have shared with you captured some of those incredible times that evolved into many of the great Mexican-American tournaments that continue to this day, including this year's Newton's Mexican-American Athletic Club's annual Mexican-American Men's Fast Pitch Tournament coming up next weekend, July 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. And we're working on, hopefully, the 75th anniversary tournament in 2 years, and we should be able to have a nice display with that. Again, thank you, and I will stop sharing this. And any questions? I think I have.
Thank you so much. That was so cool. I've got some questions, but we'll give people a chance to write those up for the chat box. So if you've got questions, please do submit those and we'll read them out loud. Ray, can you walk us a little bit through your research process? I mean, you obviously did a lot of work looking up newspaper articles, but some of those photos look like someone just pulled it out of their basement and handed it to you.
Well, the way it started is that the photos from throughout Kansas are not my doing. I appreciate Gene and Richard and those guys that helped on the booklet, but I was always focused on Newton, and we did Newton way before. And during the fiesta, so when I came here, I did a mural. I really didn't know all those facets of the mural. But in the 90s, we wanted to add, we had the fiestas, and I wanted to add a historical component to that. So I said, let's study each facet of this community. So the first fiesta we did the musicians of Newton, Mexican musicians from the 20s to like the 70s. The next year we did the ranchito, and I think the third year we did sports and the players. And so that was where that search began. You know, we would have information flyers out saying, do you have a photo? Can you share it with, can you tell us about it? And that's how we began that collecting of that. And then the research in the library is just something that, I mean, it's just found it interesting. But I'm not, I mean, I'm a retired art teacher. I'm not really a historian of the true sense. I don't have that background, but I just find it fascinating. And when you look at the mural tells a story, but there's even more stories to be told after the fact.
Thank you. And so we do have a couple questions. This person missed the intro. Have you written this up for articles or books? Can you tell us? I know that you've got your book. You wrote the chapter in Mexican American baseball in Kansas City. What other articles have you worked on?
Well, I mainly do the booklet for the tournament. I've done some writing for the newspapers and whatnot, but not anything. I mean, once again, I'm always just focused on Newton's history because I wasn't a part of it. I mean, I never played ball and I didn't grow up in Kansas, but I had the greatest connection because my wife was from Newton, and to her, that's all that town was about come 4th of July. And that's why she took it upon herself to say, let's paint a mural. And on this mural, let's document the whole history. And then that mural kind of like later, 10 years later, triggered other things for us. And that's how we ended up documenting even more.
Well, maybe a book is in your future of your own, right? How Newton
Well,
is the original Cooperstown.
That's why, well, that's a possibility of the 75th having
Yeah.
that option, that we're 2 years away. So that does give us time to at least maybe put something together. But the other thing that I'd like to do is that, when we did the 50th, we had a big show at Kaufman Museum, and we displayed all those photos. We had memorabilia, we had the Cuauhtemoc uniform, jerseys and t-shirts from different eras. And so I would like to, maybe if we do it for the 75th, that we put together a traveling show that doesn't just go to Kaufman, but then could go to Kansas City, Topeka. And Gene Chavez has put together, during those years, he's put together some great ones as well up in Kansas City. But it would be nice to maybe think about sharing them so that other people can see that. Because I had to go up to Kansas City to see that, or if they wanted to see the one in Newton, they had to come to Newton to see it. And I was just in Dodge City recently, and they have a great museum that could be a place where it could also be shared. So down the road.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. That sounds awesome. What's the future for Mexican teams?
Oh boy, Gene, that's a good one. Because this is a fine line that eventually these tournaments and these teams started out because they were discriminated against. And so they were Mexican by the mere laws and customs that were at those times, meaning that if you're Mexican, you can't be on a white team. Well, now we're in the 21st century, and they're coming up on their 75th year of playing this, but they advertise as Mexican American teams, but you can't really discriminate. And they don't. I mean, they have certain regulations in there, but I think that could always be a point of contention to somebody saying you're discriminating because you're only saying Mexicans can be on these teams, which they don't. They do allow other whites, African Americans, anybody else that wants to play. It's just that they have a limit on how many can be on the field at a time. And that could be a point of contention to say that's still discrimination. And so how long the chance to say Mexican American tournament and be true to its name, only time will tell.
What percent of the communities in Kansas were original to the area when this was part of Mexico before the 1848 Mexican-American War?
You got me there. Because, historically, there's probably a percentage, but you're also going to realize that even in those times, they didn't necessarily think that it was right to count Mexicans. They were saying, well, they're not, they'll be gone, or we're not going to include them, because the less they're included, the less we have to worry about them being covered by government or whatever. So I think that's kind of one of those iffy questions that doesn't really have a clear answer. And I see it. Go ahead.
Oh, we've got lots of questions. They're rolling in. And I'm going to also share all of your nice comments with Ray after the presentation. Did any African Americans play on Mexican American teams? I noticed in one of your pictures, it looked like there was a white boy on there, Charlie Darling. I looked up the name too.
It could
Can't remember
be,
which year it was.
again,
But
like I said, it was a rare exception. I mean, seeing that it was the times that it was just natural to say, well, we're gonna just have an all Mexican team. But, you know, I grew up in California, in Barrios, and it wasn't unusual to have a white guy in the community play off as Mexican. He hung with the Mexicans, he, you know, picked up the lingo and stuff like that. So it wasn't unusual to be accepted like that. And if they accepted you like that, then you could say, nah, come on, you're gonna play anyway with us. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happened, but it was more a rarity than an exception than the rule, as they say.
interesting. One of our attendees today says that her mom was a proud player on a Mexican American women's softball team in Wichita in the 70s, early 80s, called Las Amigas. So that's kind of fun. That was very interesting about all of the women teams. Were there enough that they could have their own kind of league of women ball players?
Well, you know, through other towns like Newton City Cab, that was just one team because Newton was really that big. The one thing I found interesting about the women's Newton City Cab is that they're in 46, 47, 48, is that they're young women right after the war, and all these young men are coming home wanting to get married and have families, and then I think that kind of was the demise of that team eventually. They couldn't continue playing because now they're at home raising families. And that's kind of like the true Mexican way of life. Like, you know, the wife is gonna raise the children and the man's gonna go out to work. And so I think that impacted that to a certain degree, that I don't see them playing continually after the fact.
And how did Mexican American baseball and softball contribute to Mexican American civil rights movements?
I think that's a tough one because I just think that they were taking their civil rights into their own hands and saying, we have a right to play this game and with our teams within this community. Whether you take us, whether you accept us on the teams or not, we're still going to play, and we should be able to play at city grounds against city teams or whatever. And I think there's that. And then from that developed other organizations. I mean, when you talk about the Post that started its own Post because they were discriminated against, well, then they went on to develop other things. They didn't just sponsor the ball teams. They were sponsoring scholarships. They were offering, you know, events for the community. And at those events, you didn't just have to be all Mexican to come. You know, it was a dance, you know, and if your wife was white or your neighbors were white, come on. And if you enjoy Mexican food or whatever, you could come to those events. So I think that was that slow acceptance of the community. The other thing that I point out is that a lot of these sponsorships from the community, the town businesses, give them a chance to slowly become assimilated into the community by saying, you know, we'll sponsor you. And then so you come into my business, you buy here. That's that slow acceptance as opposed to saying, now stay on your side of the tracks and that's it.
That's really interesting. Just like a slow, every like little step forward.
Jean, could you speak a little bit about that, about the play ball?
I have to give Jean special permission to unmute, but let me do that if you want.
I mean, I think he'll do a better job than I would like, and I know it's a great program. So.
Well, thank you, Ray. Excellent presentation. And
first of all, Jean, can you tell us who you are and what your connection is? Well,
I'm one of the co-authors of Mexican American Baseball in Kansas City. It's part of a larger project, the the Latino Baseball Project out of the University of California, State University of California, San Bernardino. So it documents Mexican baseball throughout the United States, and wherever Mexicans went, they did start their baseball teams. And later, after World War II, most GIs reverted to fast pitch softball. So I'm a historian in the Kansas City area. I work for the Kansas City Museum as well as the Wyandotte County Historical Society and Museum, and Humanities Kansas and other historical organizations. But this particular project on the baseball is, as Ray pointed out, it's a fascinating and amazing story. And you asked the question about the civil rights aspect of it. It's truly a way of saying, hey, we are not only going to play, but we're going to play better than maybe some other teams, and we can win. And so they asserted their civil rights. And out of those solidarity, community and cultural solidarity among Mexican Americans, it really, I think, gave them an opportunity to become involved in what has often been termed America's game, but they made it their game as well. So even though they were shut out for a while, and I think that assertion of their rights to be involved in the game really made a strong statement and brought about a great deal of camaraderie and solidarity among Mexican and other Latino populations. Going to the Smithsonian Institution, and I've posted, there's going to be the Smithsonian, as part of their efforts to tell this story, are telling play ball in the barrios and the big leagues. And Kansas City Museum had a great opportunity to be one of the sites where they collected artifacts, photos, and stories about Mexican Americans and other Latinos playing in the game. And that will be featured at the National Museum of American History coming up on July 9th will be the grand opening. And it's going to be a virtual opening because of the COVID closures of Smithsonian Institution's facilities. Yeah, everybody is welcome. I've listed the site there. And if you go to just play ball in the barrios and the big leagues, you can join in on that opening. There will be artifacts from the Midwest. And talking about the Cuauhtemoc uniform, I believe that uniform may be on loan to the Smithsonian National Postal Museum for an exhibit they're doing on baseball. So Kansas is well represented at a national level, thanks to Ray and others. And Ray was a great resource to me as I helped put together the book on the Mexican American baseball in Kansas City. And we made sure that the whole state, we called it the Sunflower State section of the book. And that's where Ray and Rod Martinez, that I think is on this call, this video, rather the Zoom meeting. Some of his relatives are shown there, and he was a great contributor to the book as well, as were every player. They had, as you mentioned, their own little archives in their own homes, and they were very willing to share. One of the funny things about it is that often when you ask the names of some of these players, well, they just remembered the nicknames. Oh yeah, that was a guy called Bullet. Well, I said, in order to publish a book, we need to get their full name. And that was a challenge at times, but we got through that, and we're eventually able to put together the Kansas book, and very proud of all of the individuals who were involved with it.
Jean, I'm going to go ahead and leave you unmuted for a second and let you both answer this question. Is there any way, or what is the best way that we can help get the word out about this extraordinary history?
Well, one way to attend a tournament is one place that you can you get that feel of the because it isn't just a tournament; it's actually almost like a family reunion. Back in the day, they used to have they'd have opening ceremonies, they'd have games, they'd had a dance so that the teams could socialize. And I grew up in California where communities were like gang banging against each other. And here in the Midwest, I was like surprised that they were actually socializing because there was none of that hostility towards every little town, because they were always playing with each other, against each other. And yet when the game was over, then they became really good friends about that. And there's members of the old teams that talk about when they're if they're traveling across Kansas and their car breaks down, whether it's in Salina, Kansas City, or Garden City, they have contacts that they can make through the tournament that says, hey, can you help me out? Because I need some help, or I'm kind of in a tough spot right now. And so that is like one way that they've kind of developed that relationship. But having the shows is really one way that we've done it. Gene's done it. I've done them here in Newton, and we're coming up to 75th. But it's always that opportunity to keep putting the story out is really the way it goes. There's stories that, well, we just did the cake or the TV interview, and that's another way of how it gets out little by little. But it is always kind of a constant challenge to get the story out and keep updating it. And once again, like I said, there's still so much more to this story. We're just at the tip of the iceberg. So
yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying, Ray, and have said it so well. I think going to the tournament, getting the flavor, not only of the food, but the atmosphere and the family atmosphere that prevails, and the camaraderie that exists at the tournaments is just an amazing thing. And I think that there are opportunities. If you go to the Kansas City Museum's website, we have exhibits posted that I curated at the Kansas City Museum about this history. You can also go to YouTube, look for my name, and you will find a number of videos, a 28-minute long video that documents sort of the history and features the Newton tournament very prominently, and some of the families from Newton. So I think the way to keep getting it out is to do the kind of work that Ray and others are doing, and just help people understand that this was a phenomenon like any other historical event, and needs to be recognized and appreciated by the larger community, not just the Mexican community. And I think institutions like museums and historical societies are beginning to recognize that to be inclusive, to be representative, they need to tell these stories, and sometimes be honest about the counter narratives of discrimination and segregation that took place, acknowledge it, and in that way, all of us heal together as we move forward to a brighter future for all of us.
And then real quick before we let you fade back into the audience, that event at 6 Central Daylight or East Coast time? Do you know?
Well, they have it listed at 6 o'clock Central time, which actually it starts at 7 in DC Eastern time.
Okay. But if we just Google that play ball and the Barrios and big leagues, it should come up and we should be able to find it.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks so much for popping in.
All right.
And then next question, what were the Mexican American newspapers from around this time that you were they just in the regular Newton or Wichita Eagle papers, or were you?
Yeah, mainly the Newton. Well, once again, like I said, I just focused on Newton, so I would just hit the archives there and, just spend hours zooming through microfilm, kind of looking for specific dates. And then, once you get into like, I'm looking in the summer of 1939 or whatever, I can really find stuff. Then I was doing basketball. I said, yeah, you know what? January, February. So I zoomed through that and just zoom through the sports section and try to find that little nugget of like, this is something pretty interesting. But it wasn't always high priority make the front headlines of the sports section. So
Did Wichita have a Mexican-American newspaper or anything like that?
no, not that in the 70s they did. They had El Perico, which was a community newspaper that was put out by El Hernandez that did actually had some of the staff researching some of the history or just presenting it. That's where I saw that initial basketball photo for the first time was put in there by Buster Sanchez. He was kind of like the sports editor, and so there's different places. But the other thing is just digging up those nuggets. Where do you find them? It's just like we were saying, they're in somebody's photo album, and in the attic, and some get lost. And I just found one yesterday, a beautiful nugget of a photo that was a gentleman playing, catching a ball in an athletic field, athletic park in the 30s. And I go, man, this is like, wow, this is beautiful. But I gotta follow up with who knows about it a little bit more.
And then we had a question on, maybe you could tell us more specifically where that mural is located.
The mural was hung at the ballpark, Our Lady of Guadalupe ballpark for about 10 years. And then every year they didn't put it out, and it was kind of in storage. And then the ballpark was closed out. It was an issue at the church, and so that the mural kind of like was put away. And then at the 50th display show at the museum, at the Coffin Museum, we used the mural. We pulled it out of the storage and showed it at the Coffin Museum along with the 50th tournament and all those other photos that were available. And the schools were coming through, and one of the principal from the Sunset School asked what was going to happen to it. And I said, well, it's going to get put back in storage. And she goes, well, you can hang it in my school. And so that's where it's been for the last like 20 years, hanging in the hallway of the school. We take it down once in a while to show, but I think they've taken it down twice to bring it to a certain place of display. But it's there now, and it's kind of a permanent home.
There was a comment that one of our guests happened upon a Mexican-American men's team playing out in Plainview in a tournament a few years ago. And so it might still be an active tradition here in the Wichita area. So that's kind of fun.
Yeah, Plainview has its history of itself and how it came to be that, it's kind of like a low-income housing area now, but initially it started as a place for the workers during World War II to house them because they needed so many workers during the war effort.
Let's see here. They started coming in pretty quickly there, so I want to make sure I haven't missed anybody's. I know some of the stuff that you showed was from the Kansas State Historical Society, but has the rest of it been cataloged with the Historical Society? And then
not all of it. There's still, like I said, there's still a lot of that could be shared. Like I said, like the photo that I found just recently. I found two recently. One that I knew of that was somebody posted it on Facebook like 3 years ago, and I just, back in my head, I'm gonna keep that. And I went back and she, shared it with me, and that's how I was able to present it today. But no, there should almost be like a whole collection of stuff that's available there. Those photos that I was collecting during the Fiesta days, we did like 9 years worth of every year. 1 year we did the musicians, next year we did sports, next year we did the veterans, next year we did the tournament, next year we did working on the railroad. All those photos, they're still kind of like just stored away. And I donated some to the Historical Society, but I still have some that I just keep in a vault, and that's it. That's probably where they should go before I leave this earth one day.
Hopefully not very soon.
Yeah.
Could you say more about the African-American participation playing against or with the Mexican-American teams? Was that common?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it was. And the one thing that to me, they got even less, less recognition. One of the things that I saw early on in that research was that there was a team called the Hottentots from Newton that were playing. And then as I was digging deeper, I found that the Hottentots were actually a team, I think maybe from Kansas City. They were a traveling team. They were kind of like the Harlem Globetrotters of baseball in a sense. And so they were playing around. You know, they would come to different communities. I remember reading them playing in McPherson, doing some kind of exhibition show. And so the Newton team actually took on their name, and they were the local baseball team playing in the community. And I talked to some of the historians of the African-American community of Newton and said, that's just something that I'd still like to work with you on. And actually, right as COVID hit is when we were talking about that, right prior to that. But I said, there's gotta be photos and stories out there of those teams. And then Newton had them. I think Newton had 2 of them, if I remember right. But I've never seen a photo. I had seen photos of the African-American basketball teams that when I showed the photo of the Mexican basketball team, well, there was also African-American teams that the high school acknowledged as the colored team, but didn't really let them play on the main gym. They had to play in the secondary gym, except for there was one time I read about they allowed them to play in the main gym because they were going to play a colored team from Tulsa that was traveling through. And so they knew they were going to have a big audience. So they were able to utilize the big gym, as they say. But there's a whole story there that would be nice to follow up with.
Cindy, I'm not sure what you mean by which school, because I'm not sure when that question came in. So if you want to, what school the
Asking about
mural?
what school the mural is at?
Mhm.
Sunset School in Newton. It's an elementary school.
Okay. Well, I think we've about made it through most of our questions. The rest of them are comments that I will definitely be sure to share with you.
Okay.
Did Black players play on Mexican American teams? I think you maybe addressed that.
There was eventually, yeah. Once again, I said that once they allowed, remember they allow, other ethnicities to play on their teams. It's just that when it first developed, but no, you go to tournaments and you'll see white players, black players, brown players, different denominations. So it's just they're still trying to maintain the roots of the tournament in itself. So that's the challenge.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and pop our survey link. I'll make sure I hit the right buttons into the chat window. This is a survey about today's program. If you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to complete it, those of you in attendance today, it helps us to plan our future programs, lets us know what you thought of today's program, and so we really appreciate your feedback. Thanks again to Ray Elias for this fascinating look at Mexican American baseball, and to Humanities Kansas for their support. Thank you to all of you who joined us today for your support of the Wichita Public Library. If you enjoyed today's program and you want to learn more about Wichita's diverse history of baseball, please join us for any and all of the upcoming programs. We've still got several going on in July and even one into August. You can find out more at wichitalibrary.org/baseball. He said, can you type the school name? I'm sorry. Sunset Elementary, you said, right?
I put it in there.
Oh, you did? Okay. I'm not sure that it came through, but that's okay. I think somebody else did, so we should be good. And I guess that will conclude this program today. So everyone, thanks so much. Thanks, Ray. It was great.
You.